All right. Thanks again for giving me the stage. I know it's a virtual stage. Hopefully next year we will be on stage again and then have the chance to meet people face to face. Thanks for organizing this. I know this is not easy, especially in times where things are so uncertain. Where I want to bring certainty in is really showing you what we have done with our Keptn project. Especially, you know, I assume there's a large DevOps audience out there. You might also kind of not only look into DevOps, but also SRE, site reliability engineering, because in my world, I've seen these two kind of disciplines really working close together. On the one side, DevOps using automation to deliver software into production through pipelines, and on the other side, site reliability engineers that use automation to keep systems healthy in production. And we want to make an impact here with Keptn. We want to provide a new approach. In the previous discussion, and I listened into it, people were mentioning observability is a big topic, right? You need to get observability into your systems to either react on security issues that were discussed or to react on performance problems, on scalability problems. And this is exactly what we bring to the table with Keptn. So if you want to know more later on, you see all the links here. You can follow us on Twitter, go on GitHub, check it out. It's open source. It's a CNCF project, so a Cloud Native Computing Foundation project. We are currently a sandbox project, but currently in the final review phase to become an incubating project. So if you're familiar with CNCF, it starts with sandbox, then incubating, and then graduating. We're just getting into incubating. If you happen to be at KubeCon in Valencia in a couple of weeks, we will also be there, and I will be there at the booth. During the day, I do work for Dynatrace, a software intelligence company where we bring observability to our customers. But today is all about our open source project. So let me tell you how I've structured it. My talk in 3 acts. The first act is, what is Keptn? Right? Because for most of you, it's probably the first time you hear about it, key use cases and who is adopting it. Second thing is why we built Keptn, which problem does it solve? Because if you see me walk through the use cases, you may think, well, yeah, there's other tools that can do similar things. I want to tell you exactly why we built it and why we built it that way, because we're not just yet another if this, then do this tool. And then the third one is how Keptn really works, the architecture, and especially the extensibility components. All right. So first, what is Keptn? I'm speaking here to a DevOps community, right? And therefore, I want to highlight how Keptn can help you. So Keptn is an open source event and data-driven automation plane for DevOps and SREs. So what does this mean? First of all, Keptn allows you to orchestrate your multi-stage delivery sequences. So you can have Keptn orchestrate a deploy, a test, a validate, a release into the next stage. Multi-stages, Keptn is orchestrating this for you. What Keptn, however, also does, and this comes kind of back to what was also discussed in the panel earlier, Keptn also gives you day 1 and day 2 operations orchestration, which means Keptn can roll out your canaries in a safe way, but also what was discussed earlier around security problems. If a problem comes in, security, an outage, a performance problem, a scalability issue, Keptn can assess the situation based on the data from the observability platform and then execute different actions, validate if the system is at a healthy state, and then go into a loop until the problem is either solved, or if it's not solved, it can escalate. Now you may wonder, okay, this is just an orchestrator of different tasks. What is different? What's different is that the validate piece here, this is a core component of Keptn. Keptn makes data-driven decisions based on SLOs, service level objectives. SLOs is I think by now, very popular term that came out of Google's site reliability engineering. So what does this mean in Keptn talk? Keptn connects to any observability platform to query your metrics. Now we started with Prometheus initially, and then with Dynatrace. The community recently built an integration with Datadog, but because we are an open platform, you can build integrations with any observability platform, whatever it is, to pull in the data and to let Keptn make data-driven decisions as it orchestrates your processes. Now, most important is Keptn doesn't replace any of your individual tools, but it connects them. So if you have your Jenkins pipelines, if you have your Argo pipelines, if you have your Helm charts, whatever tools you see up there, testing tools, notification tools, you can keep them but what Keptn does, it connects and calls them to fulfill a certain task. And the way it does it through an open event standard. And I think that's the unique thing as well, because we are not just building new point-to-point integrations that are specific to Keptn. We're currently working through the CNCF and the CDF, that's the Continuous Delivery Foundation. The Continuous Delivery Foundation currently has a so-called CD Events Special Interest Group, where we are standardizing the protocol and the way we're sending events to tools, the payload, so that we can actually trigger a deployment tool, a testing tool, a notification tool, an observability tool. Because one of the big things we really want to solve is we want to stop having new tools on the market, a new deployment tool, a new testing tool, a new notification tool that all bring in their proprietary APIs. We want to standardize on how we communicate with these tools. We want to standardize the payload, which then allows us to orchestrate these tools, and you can plug in and plug out tools because they all adhere to the same standard. Right? I will come into this in more detail. Now, a very core component, as I said, is the SLO evaluation. So the way this works, and you'll see it later in the demo, there's going to be a special task that we call evaluation. What evaluation does in Keptn, it triggers an internal service from Keptn. So when you install Keptn, and I'll show you also my installation on my Kubernetes cluster, we have a core service that's called the Lighthouse service. Right? The Lighthouse, it's looking whether the Keptn can actually steer its ship safely through the harbors of different clouds. But the point here is you can give the Lighthouse service a so-called SLO YAML file. The SLO YAML specifies what are you expecting your system to look like in order to consider it healthy. So you can see here error rate, JVM memory, count, DB calls. So you specify there are certain metrics, indicators that come from the observability platform, and you're expecting certain criteria, pass and warning. And what Keptn does with it, or the Lighthouse service, it then calls and reaches out to whatever observability platform or data store you have. So for instance, we need to know, how do you query error rate, or how do you query JVM memory? How do you query the number of database calls? That means depending on which monitoring platform, observability platform you have, you then have in a separate file, this is a nice separation of concerns, the definition of how you can actually query these data points. So that means Keptn is triggering these tools through a standardized event, say, hey, I need count DB calls, error rate, JVM memory for this particular environment. So we also give the context of the environment to that tool for a particular time frame, let's say after the deployment happened or the period of the test that you ran. These tools then report back the actual metrics, the actual values, like you can see here, 4.3%, or JVM memory, 360 megabyte. And what Keptn then does, or the Lighthouse service, it takes those values, compares them against your objective, calculates a score for each individual objective, and then calculates a total score. So it's basically like a health indicator across multiple indicators. And then depending on the total score, what you specified, what you consider pass and warning, it either marks that state, that task, that validation task as green, pass, or warning, or failed. All right, so enough with the slides, at least for now. Let me quickly switch over. So first of all, if you want to know more about Keptn, Keptn.sh is kind of our website. That's a good starting point. The other starting point that you have is you can obviously go to GitHub. So github.com/Keptn. We are organized in multiple projects. Keptn is the core project. We also have a Keptn sandbox and a Keptn contrib. So different, you can see here Keptn contrib, Keptn sandbox, and also a sock shop for some demos. This is where you find all the information. Now, what I have here, this is my Keptn installation, and I hope you can see it well. My Keptn installation runs on, and let me not scare you, but let me show you. I run Keptn on an EC2 machine. Well, Keptn itself requires a Kubernetes cluster. I decided to just go with a lightweight K3s, but you can really install it on OpenShift, on any Kubernetes flavor, also on any of the services that, let's say, an AKS, an EKS, a GKE, whatever you want. If you install it, the core components, you can see here, I have a couple of pods here in my Keptn namespace. The core ones that are, it's the bridge. The bridge is what you see in the back, that's the UI. We also have an API gateway, which means we also have a very rich API where you can interact with Keptn, you can configure Keptn, you can trigger automation, you can pull data out. Some other things, the Lighthouse service that I talked about, right? That's a very important one. Internally, Keptn is using an event-driven model. So we're using Nets, which is another CNCF project for that. There's obviously a data store and a couple of other things. I installed a couple of additional so-called Keptn services. One, for instance, for Locust, which is a testing tool. One for Dynatrace, because that's my observability platform. And we have some other cool things like a generic executor or a job executor where Keptn can execute any container image as a Kubernetes job. And there's a couple of more things in here, right? But you can see, I just run this on a very lightweight EC2 machine. Keptn itself is organized in projects. I have a couple here, and I want to start with the first use case. And I want to just show you how the core component, remember this SLO evaluation works. So typically what I see people using Keptn for starting with is for release validation. So in this case, I have a project called release validation. And in that release validation project, I can have multiple so-called stages. In my case, I only have production as a stage. So you can also go to environment. You can see here, I only have a production stage. You can then add services. We call them services. This could be a microservice. This could be an application. It really depends on you, kind of what you bind it to. In my case, I do a lot of workshops with my users. And in my workshops, I typically deploy a very simple app, and I give every attendee the same app, but they're responsible for that app. And kind of the story goes, you deploy it and your customer is, in this case, either Apple or Acer. So I typically have stock symbols. So in case you wonder, why does he say Acer and AAPL? And I have others too. This is just part of my workshops that I typically do, and also part of the tutorials that are out there. Now, the important thing is, and this is where people get started with, remember the SLO-based evaluation. So what I have here is I can run and I can say, Keptn, what I really want from you is to start with, I want you to evaluate for me the health of my system. And therefore, please reach out to my definition of my SLI, my SLOs, and then pull them back automatically from observability platform, and then calculate the score. And you can see as I click through, every column basically is an evaluation. And I did a couple of ones earlier. You can also give it a name like release April 26, next release April 26. This is what I did. And then if I scroll down here, you actually get to see all the raw data that comes in. And you can also see why Keptn is considering a certain metric to be good or failed, because when I specify the metric, I can also specify what is the objective, and whether when it meets the objective, you get points, right? You get a score for every metric. And then we normalize the total score to a value between 0 and 100, and then you get a total score. In my case, the total score was 59, which is smaller than 70, which I have specified to be kind of my mark. All right, this is kind of like what I consider. So what happens behind the scenes? There's multiple ways of doing this. I want to show you the easy way, at least from my perspective. Behind the scenes here, I have a dashboard, and that's one of the integrations we've built, especially with users that are using Dynatrace as their observability platform. So behind the scenes here, this definition comes from a dashboard that looks like this, right? I can build a dashboard. If I'm responsible for a certain app, for a certain environment, I put all of my metrics on here that are relevant for me. And as you can see here in Dynatrace, at least, I have different options to specify thresholds. I can put them either on the visualization tile here, or I can also put them in here as part of the definition on the header, pass. And here you can see a pass. You can specify the thresholds. So this dashboard in this case will then be analyzed every time I tell Keptn to run an evaluation. Now, how do you run an evaluation? Let's go back here, right? I can actually go into my services, and I can say trigger new sequence. If I trigger new sequence, I can say evaluate for my AAPL service in production. And then for the evaluation, I can give it a time frame. So I can say, hey, let's say in the last hour, I want to evaluate. I can give it some keys. I can say executed by Andy. And this can be build ID, my next release. And then I can even do maybe triggered by, I could even specify something like if you have a deployment tool, I don't know, maybe, I don't know, myjenkins.com, myjenkins.myorg.abc, my Jenkins pipeline, okay? So I can trigger this sequence here. Now this trigger sequence is really not doing nothing else than making a REST call to the Keptn API to trigger a new sequence. And as you can see here, it's now running off and it starts with the evaluation. Remember I talked about standardizing event payloads. So if I click on the event payload here, you can see this is some of the event payload we are standardizing, not only to trigger an action from the outside towards Keptn, but also this is some of the payloads that Keptn is then sending out to trigger other tools to do certain things. But you can see here, it's like labels as metadata. This is the context of the automation project, release validation, APL, and production. Evaluation is now an additional piece of metadata I put in for a particular thing to be done. So the cool thing with this is now this is running. It is the evaluation. Remember, the Lighthouse service is kicking in. It's all event driven because what Keptn does behind the scenes, it is again sending another event and say, hey, the evaluation was triggered. So the evaluation is a task that I specified. And now I want somebody to handle that particular task. And in our case, this is the built-in Lighthouse service. So the Lighthouse service says, I'm good, I know what to do. I'm reaching out to a particular monitoring tool that is also listening for the events. And now, as you can see, a Dynatrace is kicking in and is kind of then pulling the data back. While this is running, let me show you one more thing. If you see here on the settings on the left, this is where so we have some secret management, right? If you're integrating with different tools, you can specify your secrets. And under integrations, this is where you have the list of, we call them Keptn services that are currently subscribing to events from the outside. So there are the built-in services like remediation service, Lighthouse, approval, webhook. Then I have on my target system, I have a different EC2 machine where I run my Helm service to deploy Helm charts, my Locust, this is my testing tool and so on. They are also showing up here and they basically all have an event subscription. So they are subscribing to certain events for certain projects or all projects. So that means they are getting notified when Keptn needs to do something or needs some job to be done. What I really like is the webhook service because I've specified something here. I basically specified here in that with that subscription, I want whenever Keptn executes the task evaluation and when this task is either triggered, started, or finished, in my case I said finished, when the evaluation finished, I want to post and I want to call a webhook. And you know, this is where you could send it to MS Teams, to Slack, or to any other tool. I just do for demo purposes, as you can see here, a webhook site. This is a really neat website that is just providing you a webhook for testing. So here, 10:20, right? This was 1 minute ago. I got the latest post in, and that's it. Hey, result was failed. This was the score, and this was the evaluation. Now, why did this happen? Let me go back to Keptn now. In Keptn, when my sequence was executed, right? I triggered the sequence from external. I have the evaluation being executed. The Lighthouse service in the end said, hey, based on the data that came back from the monitoring tool, I compared it against all the objectives. The result is failed. And then I said, well, I want to be calling a webhook if a certain event happens, like the evaluation was finished, then I'm passing this over. So this is the very most simplest use case. I want to show you one that is a little more, let's say, interesting, and then also go a little bit behind the scenes. The demo rollout is a really cool one. The demo rollout is where I use Argo rollouts to actually do the delivery. So again, demo rollout is the project. You can see here in this case, I have staging and production as two, we call them environments or stages. And if I now go to the latest sequence, right, I kicked this off a while ago, but in staging, actually, it's funny. I did this when I was at DevOps Days 2 weeks ago at in Raleigh. So I did this live, Andy, while sitting at DevOps Days. And so what actually happened here, this is a much longer delivery pipeline or sequence, right? The first thing it does, Monaco, it triggers a task that is supposed to configure my monitoring. So setting up dashboards, setting up alerts. Then deployment. In my case, I have Helm that is listening for that event and is then deploying my app. Then I have a validate stage. So validating, and here I'm using the generic executor that is just triggering a Python script that validates if the URL is accessible, what the deployment stuff deployed, right? Then I have a release. So here I'm using Argo rollouts for doing blue-green deployments, and I get all the Argo roll output. Then we have some tests. This is where I run some low-cost tests. Then the evaluation happens, same thing, blue SLIs, SLOs, and if everything is good, then it switches over. If I scroll up here a little bit, you can see here it went from staging into production. Now in production, I decided to use multi-canary deployments. So I have first a delivery stage. So I deploy it again. I deploy the changes in production using Helm, validate, same thing as before. But then the thing is, instead of doing blue-green deployments, I decided to have multiple canary phases. So in the first canary phase, I'm using Argo again to switch to, if you're familiar with canary deployments, you can basically specify stages on how many pods should be updated. So Argo is taking care of it. So I say Argo release, then I test, evaluate. If everything is good, I go into the next canary phase, and so on and so forth. Behind the scenes, we again have with every single evaluation, with every phase, we have our SLIs and SLOs evaluated. And so there's a lot of things here. Last thing I want to show you before I go back to the slides, behind every automation project, there is a Git repository. Actually, Keptn internally holds a Git repository, but then you can specify an upstream Git. In my case, I'm just using Git, right? Very simple. Now here, I want to show you something. When you create a new Keptn project, the first thing you need to specify is a so-called shipyard file. And that shipyard file really now includes all of this configuration I've shown you earlier about what tasks should be executed, right? So here I'm saying I have a delivery sequence in the staging. I have Monaco as a task, deployment, validate, release, and test. Then an evaluation, then an approval. And here you can also see how you can trigger other sequences based on the status of the final status of, let's say, if staging delivery finished with fail, I want to do a rollback, which means there's a task rollback that would be handled again from my Argo to rollback. Key point here is I'm not specifying any tools here. I'm just specifying tasks that are then executed because Keptn is sending an event and they're subscribed to by my different tools, and then they act upon. And then Keptn really becomes the orchestrator with the very important thing here, the evaluation that's built in is always reaching out to your observability tool. Now, there's other things in here that is important. For every stage that you have, staging and production, you have a branch in your Git repository. And in here you have subfolders, for instance, simple node, that was my sample app. And this is also where you can either use the dashboard approach that I've shown you earlier to specify kind of your SLIs and SLOs, but you can also do it purely as YAML. So this is here the place where I specify for my multi-stage delivery example that I've just shown you, what should be the criteria for my response time P95, for my error rate, and so on and so forth, right? So this is the criteria. I can change it here. I can give it a different weight. I can also specify whether one of these metrics should be a key metric, meaning if that fails, I don't care about the rest, the whole build should fail. Security is a great example. If you have a security tool that can, like in Dynatrace, we do automated security detection, vulnerability detection. We therefore give you a metric. And if that metric shows you have a vulnerability, then you can say, I don't want to push this code forward if we find a critical vulnerability. Okay? So I think pretty powerful. There's much more I could show you, but I also want to make sure I get back to some of my explanation. So who is adopting Keptn? We have countless of examples. Typically, people start from performance engineering, SREs, like Mike. He is using the approach that I've shown you earlier. He runs his load runner tests on a daily basis, and then he built the dashboard, and that dashboard then automatically gets analyzed now every time after he finishes his test. So automatically he gets the analysis at the end of the test, green, yellow, or red. Another example, this is from Raiffeisen Software. It's the bank in Austria, or it's a software company in Austria that builds the online banking services for Raiffeisen, and I think probably in Poland you're familiar with Raiffeisen. They are integrating this with Jenkins. So Jenkins is deploying a new build, is running the tests, and then they're calling into Keptn to get the automated evaluation across all sorts of metrics here that they're pulling in. You can see here our response time core user journal login, response time core user journal logout. So they're executing different tests, and then Keptn is doing the evaluation from the metrics. Another cool use case is from Volusion. Artem was doing this similar what I've just shown you with my Argo example. They are using their CD pipeline is pushing their artifacts to JFrog, and that then kicks off a multi-stage delivery pipeline with Argo, with JMeter, and so on and so forth. By the way, we shared a slide later on. You also see YouTube video links here. All of these people have done demos on the Keptn YouTube channel. Another cool one is P&G. So Savitha, she had a kind of like, hey, if there's an alert coming in, and I think this was what was discussed also earlier on the panel, if an alert is coming in, then Keptn can be used to execute a sequence of remediation tasks. So we have a specific feature in there where your Keptn can say, give me the next task for a particular problem that was specified in the YAML file. And in her case, she was triggering, she would let Keptn trigger custom Python scripts that was trying to bring the system back to a healthy state. But the cool thing is with Keptn, right, it always evaluates. Did this action actually solve the problem? And if not, execute the next action if it's specified. And if not, then escalate. We also had some cool testimonials. Tarash, he's a performance engineer at Facebook. He made some nice comments about, Keptn feels like a reference implementation of Google's SRE handbook. So there was a really nice comment we received from him. All right. So this is what Keptn is and who is using Keptn. Now the question is, why did we build Keptn at all? Because honestly, if you have Jenkins or any other tools, right, you can do all of this yourself. You can build a large Jenkins script, execute your tests, add result analysis. You can push notifications to Slack. You can integrate with your APM. You can add an approval. You can do whatever you want, right? These are really powerful tools. They've been around for a while and they have a lot of integrations. So why do we build it? Well, the reason why, because we've seen that if you build all of this logic, you end up like Christian with scripts, with your automation scripts that tend to be really complex or get really complex if you build all of this in, and if you do it across multiple environments and do a lot of copy pasting, right? And that is hard to maintain. Also, we at Dynatrace, Dieter, when we at Dynatrace moved towards more microservice architecture, we stuck with Jenkins because that's what we knew. So we started with new pipelines to kind of define what should our pipelines look like. And then more services were onboarded. Every service team had their own little flavor of testing tool that they wanted and their own little deployment tool. So we ended up with different permutations of the same initial or original pipeline. We then actually did an analysis on pipeline code duplication, and we found out that we had a high level of code complexity and code duplication, which meant it was hard to maintain all of this because pipelines were constantly broken. So this is why we said we need a new approach, because if we need to invest into building observability into your delivery and remediation, if we need to add new testing tools, chaos engineering, you need to integrate with, for this team with Slack, with the other team with whatever they have, then it becomes very hard, it doesn't scale. And so this is why we built Keptn. So now, how does Keptn work? I think you've seen already a lot of it, but I want to refresh this. So Keptn, oh Keptn, my Keptn, we really said, well, in the old days, well, what we've seen and what I've just shown you, we have seen these large pipelines that had these hard-coded tool integrations with sometimes the config files as well for Helm, for testing as part of that automation script. And so we said, the first thing we need to do, we need to remove these hard-coded dependencies from an automation script to a specific tool, because that makes it hard to change the tool and also breaks the pipeline in case a tool changes the API. So then we said, if we are removing those dependencies, then we want to, on the left side, have the process definition. We call this sequences in Keptn. On the right side, the tools, we call them Keptn services. Any type of configuration should end up in Git, what I've shown you as well. Keptn holds a Git repository. And then in order to connect everything, we're using eventing. right? That's what you would also do in software engineering. What software engineers are doing in architects, they're breaking the monolithic pieces into smaller ones, and then they're connecting all the individual microservices through events, and you have an orchestrator that makes sure that everything still works correctly. So to give you the example, but I think you've seen it, but I have 3 examples here. Performance, I have a sequence that's called performance with deploy, test, and evaluate. And you could say, Keptn, trigger my performance sequence in staging for a certain image. You can add additional metadata. And then what Keptn does, it sends those events. You may have one deployment tool subscribe to that event, and then a notification tool to say, I want to push it over to Slack. Once this is done, Keptn sends the next event based on your shipyard definition. Could be test. You may have testing tool number 1, and then it's doing the evaluation. Right? And here, the evaluation would go to your monitoring observability platform, and then maybe at the end, you even notify again when everything is good. So example number 1, again, we call this a shipyard. We call the tools the uniform. We call, well, the config is the config repo, and then we have cloud events. And these are the ones we are currently standardizing with the community. So Canary rollout, this is what I showed you earlier also in my live demo, right? So you may have a different sequence, you may have different tools now that you use, different notification tools, but it's the same concept. Keptn, trigger, Canary rollout. Here's some additional information like the image, and then Keptn just sends out the events. Whatever tools you have that subscribe to those events will do the job. Keptn will always evaluate, and then depending on that, decides what to do next. Right? So again, this is just also for your information later on. If you look into this last use case, remediation. So what you've seen from Savitha, you may have different tools now. You have an infrastructure automation tool, a different deployment, different notification, a ticketing tool. So here, if you say Keptn, trigger remediation in production, the problem is high failure rate and the root cause is a log disk latency, then we give you the option to specify a list of remediation tasks based on a certain problem or root cause. And then let's say the first action could be the cleaning disk. So it sends an event, clean disk, whatever tools you have that can do it, pick up then the task, execute it. Then Keptn will evaluate. That's built in the remediation sequence. So after every action, Keptn evaluates. If everything good, great, done. If not, it looks into the next action. Maybe the next action will be a rollback. Right? Different tools jump in, whoever is subscribed, again, evaluation. If everything good, great. If not, and you're running out of actions in your run book, then we can always escalate, like creating a ticket. So to sum it up, we want to help you as you're automating more. We want to help you to reduce the complexity by letting Keptn do the work for you, right? We are providing, I think, a better way. We are, as you can see here, we have separation of process and tooling. Everything is stored in Git. SLOs is what drives everything. Most importantly, we connect with your existing tools. So really, keep the investment in the tools, but let them be connected and orchestrated by Keptn. Yesterday, or last week actually, we had a cool session from René Forstner. He works in Austria here, and he showed us how he took a Jenkins pipeline, a long one that did everything, broke it into individual smaller Jenkins pipelines, like one for build, one for deploy, one for test. And then he had Keptn orchestrate these 3 Jenkins pipelines, which means each individual pipeline was much less complex, was much easier to manage. And then automatically what he got as a benefit is he automatically from Keptn got the SLO evaluation. And now he can also replace, let's say, an individual stage from his Jenkins pipeline in the future for other projects. So for instance, he may want to have a different way to deploy for certain projects and therefore uses Helm instead of his Jenkins pipelines. Right? I always say then this is now the management friendly version from left to right, right? You can see it easily. You can either say, take the red pill or the green, or the red and the green pill. Either, keep what you're doing and be happy with it and have job security because you keep doing what you've been doing for a while, or look into the future, make it easier for you so that you can actually invest more time in what's really important. So great thing is for me, you can trigger all of this from any tool. And this is also important. Right, I see a lot of organizations, they have their Jenkins, they have their Azure DevOps, their GitLab, they build they build the containers, push it up to a registry, and then they trigger whatever sequence makes sense. Most of them start just with the evaluation, and then they extend the sequence to say, hey, now we want Keptn to also execute a test before. And maybe for this new project, we also want Keptn to run the deployment. So our CI pipeline becomes much smaller. So to sum it up, Keptn, SLO-driven automation for DevOps and SRE. That means whoever you are, you pick your use case. You then bring your configuration, because all the tools that you obviously have need some configuration. You also need to bring your SLI and your SLO. You connect your tools, and then Keptn will take care of the rest, right? Hopefully makes your life easier. And what was also mentioned earlier in the panel discussion, because you talked a lot about open source. Pick an open source that is actually really not only done by one single person, you are then responsible. This is like a bottleneck. I want to say thank you now to Dynatrace, because Dynatrace has really donated, first of all, this project to the CNCF 2 years ago. And we also have a development team dedicated, paid by Dynatrace, but really supporting Keptn, bringing it forward. By now, we have a lot more external contributors as well. But if you want to get some confidence then into an open source tool, then it's definitely, you know, an open source tool like this that has the support of a large organization, because we are using Keptn internally, and we have a lot of customers that are using it, and we believe it's better if we open it up to a larger community to then integrate it with any type of tool. So I think from my end, this was my quick run through. I know we have about now 15 minutes or so for Q&A. I hope there are questions. I can always go back also to more demos. If you have specific questions, I can go back into the demo. But with this, I want to hand it over back to kind of the stage or the podium or the moderator, and see if there's any questions. And thank you so far.